The story of Edgar Allan Poe begins in the cold winter of Boston, 1809, a child born between two worlds, the stage and the street. His parents, David Poe Jr., an American actor, and Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins Poe, an English-born actress, carried the restless spirit of performers, moving from town to town, applause to silence. Edgar was their second child, between an elder brother, Henry, and a younger sister, Rosalie. Their blood carried Irish roots, tracing back to their grandfather, David Poe, who left County Cavan around 1750. But before the boy could even speak of dreams, his world cracked. His father vanished in 1810. His mother died a year later, tuberculosis claiming her as it had so many before. Poe, barely 2, became an orphan adrift in the world. He was taken in by John Allan, a wealthy merchant in Richmond, Virginia. The Allans traded in tobacco, cloth, and human lives. They gave him a name, Edgar Allan Poe, but never made him a son. John Allan was a man of contradictions, generous one day, cruel the next. He baptized Edgar into the Episcopal Church and then sent him across the Atlantic. Between 1815 and 1820, the boy wandered through the gray skies of Scotland and the crowded streets of London, studying in Irvine, Chelsea, and Stoke Newington, quiet schools filled with order, ink, and discipline. Yet even then, the young Poe carried within him a growing loneliness, the kind that would later bleed into his writing. By 1820, the Allans returned to Richmond. Poe, now a teenager, joined a youth honor guard to welcome the Marquis de Lafayette in 1824, the kind of ceremony meant for bright futures. A year later, Allan inherited a fortune, nearly $21 million in modern worth, and celebrated by buying a grand home called Moldavia. Yet, despite the wealth, affection between Allan and Poe had thinned to formality. When Poe enrolled at the University of Virginia in 1826, he dreamed of literature, languages, and love. He may have been engaged to Sarah Elmira Royster, a soft light in his young life. But college was chaos. Jefferson's University promised freedom, and the students took it too literally. Gambling, drinking, and debts circled Poe like vultures. His foster father refused to cover his expenses fully, and Poe, desperate and proud, turned to cards and chance. By the end of the year, he was penniless, heartbroken after learning that Sarah had married another man. He left the university and Richmond both. Alone, he walked the cobbled streets of Boston in 1827, surviving through clerical work and short writings. To mask his identity, he began signing his name, Henri Le Rene, a man already haunted, searching for meaning before the world knew his name. That's where the myth of Edgar Allan Poe, the poet, the dreamer, the doomed genius, truly began. By the spring of 1827, Edgar Allan Poe had reached a breaking point. He was penniless, estranged from his foster father, and adrift in a world that seemed indifferent to his talent. So, with nowhere else to turn, the young poet walked into a recruiting office and enlisted in the United States Army under a false name, Edgar A. Perry. He claimed to be 22. In truth, he was only 18. For $5 a month, Private Perry began his service at Fort Independence in Boston Harbor, a lonely post surrounded by gray waves and gunpowder air. That same year, he quietly published his first book, a thin 40-page collection of verse titled Tamerlane and Other Poems, signed only by a Bostonian. Only 50 copies were printed. Almost none were sold. The world didn't notice. Not yet. Soon his regiment was transferred south to Fort Moultrie in Charleston, where the humid air clung like a second skin. Poe worked with his hands and his mind, promoted to artificer, preparing shells for artillery. His pay doubled, but his soul didn't. 2 years later, he'd climbed to the rank of sergeant major for artillery, the highest a non-commissioned man could go. Yet he longed to escape. He confessed his true name and story to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Howard, who offered him a deal. If Poe could reconcile with his foster father, he'd be discharged with honor. But letters to John Allan went unanswered. Then, in early 1829, tragedy struck again. Frances Allan, the only mother figure Poe had known, died. He arrived a day too late to say goodbye. Perhaps, softened by grief, Allan agreed to help Poe secure a place at West Point, the U.S. Military Academy. Poe was honorably discharged in April 1829 and spent the months before his appointment with his aunt, Maria Clem, in Baltimore, sharing a small home with her daughter Virginia, his brother Henry, and his frail grandmother. In that dim house, he received something rare: praise. Critic John Neal published a short review calling his poetry promising, what Poe described as the very first words of encouragement I ever remember to have heard. By mid-1830, Poe was a cadet at West Point. The academy was strict, regimented, and cold, a poor match for a restless poet. When John Allan remarried and had children, the final thread between them snapped. Disowned and disillusioned, Poe decided to end his military career the only way he knew how, through rebellion. He stopped attending roll calls, classes, and church, forcing a court-martial. On February 8, 1831, he was expelled for gross neglect of duty, exactly as he planned. Before leaving, he collected funds from sympathetic cadets, $170 in total, to publish another book of poems. Printed in New York, Poems, 1831, carried a quiet dedication. To the U.S. Corps of Cadets, this volume is respectfully dedicated. Among its verses were works that would echo for centuries, to Helen and The City in the Sea. He returned to Baltimore once more, to family, to poverty, and to loss. That same year, his brother Henry, weakened by alcohol and illness, died in August. At 22, Poe had already buried nearly everyone who had ever loved him. But through every death, rejection, and failure, something inside him hardened. The iron that would one day shape the world's most haunting poet. When Edgar Allan Poe buried his brother Henry in the summer of 1831, it seemed as though every tether to family, fortune, and favor had been cut. What remained was the ink, his only inheritance, his only weapon. But for years, that weapon failed to feed him. He struggled in obscurity, trying to survive on words in a nation that did not yet value them. America had no copyright laws to protect its writers. Publishers filled their pages with cheap reprints of English authors, leaving little room or payment for homegrown voices. Poe, restless and proud, became one of the first Americans to live entirely by his pen, though the pen paid in hunger more often than in coin. The 1830s were a turbulent time. Economic ruin swept through the country after the Panic of 1837, and the newborn literary industry, fueled by a boom of short-lived magazines, teetered on chaos. Editors often vanished without paying their writers. Others paid months late, if at all. Poe's letters from this period read like quiet cries for survival, earnest, desperate, and humiliating in their honesty. Still, he pressed on. Abandoning the fragile lyricism of poetry, he turned to prose, sharpening his craft like a soldier reforging a blade. In 1833, a Baltimore newspaper, the Saturday Visitor, announced a literary contest. Poe submitted a strange and chilling story titled M.S. Found in a Bottle. It won. The prize was modest, but the reward was far greater: attention. One of the judges, John P. Kennedy, a respected Baltimore gentleman, saw potential in the impoverished writer. Kennedy became Poe's first true patron, helping him find paid work and introducing him to Thomas W. White, the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond. In 1835, Poe was hired as assistant editor. For the first time, the young man who once begged for coins now wielded influence in American letters. But his demons followed him. White dismissed him within weeks. Rumors said for drunkenness. Still, talent has a way of earning second chances. Poe promised reform and was reinstated soon after. That same year, his personal life took a controversial turn. He obtained a marriage license to wed his 13-year-old cousin, Virginia Clem. He was 26. Historians still debate whether they married immediately or waited. What is certain is that Poe brought Virginia and her mother to Richmond, where the three lived together, a fragile but loving family born from necessity and affection. By May 1836, they were officially married in a quiet Presbyterian ceremony. The record falsely listed Virginia's age as 21. Through these years, Poe poured himself into the Messenger. He reviewed books with surgical precision, wrote essays that sliced through mediocrity, and filled its pages with poetry and tales. Under his pen, circulation reportedly grew from 700 to 3,500, a remarkable leap for a regional journal. But behind every review and every line of verse was a man still haunted by hunger, rejection, and ghosts of the past, fighting to carve a place in a world that refused to pay for its own imagination. By 1838, Edgar Allan Poe's restless journey carried him to Philadelphia, a city of noise, ambition, and ink. Between then and 1844, he lived in 4 different homes, never long enough to unpack the weight of his poverty. One of those houses, a modest brick dwelling at 532 North 7th Street, still stands today, silent witness to a mind both brilliant and tormented. That same year, he released his only novel, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, a strange and haunting sea tale that blended adventure with nightmare. Critics were divided, but readers remembered it. It was Poe's first true step toward the surreal, the grotesque, and the unknowable, the world that would soon define him. In 1839, his reputation as a fierce literary critic grew when he became assistant editor of Burton's Gentleman's Magazine. From that desk, he fired words like bullets, sharp, elegant, and merciless. He wrote stories, reviews, and essays that drew both admiration and enemies. That same year saw the publication of Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, 2 volumes of darkness, mystery, and melancholy. The reviews were mixed, and the pay was meager. But his voice, strange, rhythmic, and unmistakable, had begun to echo. Poe dreamed bigger. In June 1840, he announced plans for his own magazine, The Pen, later renamed The Stylus. His advertisement in the Saturday Evening Post promised a new era of literary excellence. A monthly literary journal edited and published by Edgar A. Poe. But dreams need money, and Poe had none. The stylus would never see print. He left Burton's after a year and joined Graham's Magazine, a more successful monthly publication. There, his sharp eye and relentless editing helped the magazine flourish. By the end of 1841, Graham's was celebrating an unprecedented rise in readership, and Poe's name was among the editors who signed the note of triumph. For a brief moment, he was part of a winning team. But fortune, as always, was fleeting. Around this time, Poe sought a position in the John Tyler administration, claiming allegiance to the Whig Party. With political connections through friends, he hoped for a government post, perhaps at the Philadelphia Custom House. Yet, when opportunity arrived, Poe didn't. He missed a crucial meeting, later blaming illness. His friends suspected drink. The post went to someone else. Then, in January 1842, tragedy returned. While playing the piano, Virginia, his young wife, suddenly coughed up blood, the unmistakable sign of tuberculosis. Poe described it as the breaking of a blood vessel in her throat. She survived, but barely. He did not. His mind unraveled under the weight of fear and helplessness. The bottle became his constant companion. He left Graham's soon after and wandered again, searching for stability, for money, for purpose. Brief stints followed at the Evening Mirror and then the Broadway Journal, which he eventually owned. Yet ownership brought more enemies than peace. He feuded publicly with other writers, even accusing Henry Wadsworth Longfellow of plagiarism, a scandal that left Poe isolated, though Longfellow never dignified it with a response. Then, on a cold day in January 1845, everything changed. The Evening Mirror published a poem called The Raven. Readers stopped. They whispered. They remembered. In a single night, Poe became a literary sensation, a man whose words could summon the darkness itself. He earned $9 for the poem. But fame, not fortune, had finally found him. By 1846, the Broadway Journal, Poe's final attempt at independence, collapsed under debt and disillusion. The dream of controlling his own voice, of editing without compromise, was gone. With little left but grief and manuscripts, Poe moved north, settling in a small white cottage in Fordham, New York, a quiet village that would later become part of the Bronx. The home was humble, a few small rooms, a porch that caught the evening wind, and a view of the woods beyond. Yet it was there, in that fragile stillness, that Poe lived through the most tender and tragic chapter of his life. The cottage still stands today, preserved as the Edgar Allan Poe cottage near the corner of the Grand Concourse and Kingsbridge Road. In Fordham, Poe found brief companionship with the Jesuits at St. John's College, now Fordham University, who welcomed the troubled writer as a thoughtful visitor. But peace was short-lived. Virginia, his beloved wife, grew weaker each day, her illness consuming her slowly, mercilessly. On January 30th, 1847, she died in that cottage, the cold winter air filling the silence she left behind. Poe was shattered. He had always written of loss, but now he lived within it. The theme that haunted his stories, the death of a beautiful woman, was no longer metaphor. It was memory. After Virginia's passing, Poe's mind began to fracture. He drifted between melancholy and mania, between sobriety and drink. Friends described him as restless, wandering, and worn. He sought solace where he could, in poetry, in prayer, and in the arms of others who might briefly silence the ghosts. In Providence, he courted Sarah Helen Whitman, a poet with a sharp mind and fragile health. They shared words, dreams, and a strange spiritual bond, but it ended in ruin, Poe's drinking, his volatility, and perhaps the interference of Whitman's cautious mother destroyed the engagement before it could become marriage. Heartbroken again, Poe returned to Richmond, the city of his youth, and found himself drawn back to a familiar face, Sarah Elmira Royster, his first love, now widowed. The circle of his life had nearly closed. The orphaned boy, the haunted writer, the widower, reaching back for the woman he once lost to time. In the chill of early October, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe's long descent came to its quiet, tragic end. On October 3rd, in the streets of Baltimore, a man named Joseph W. Walker found Poe collapsed outside a tavern, delirious, weak, and dressed in clothes that were not his own. Walker later wrote that the poet was in great distress and in need of immediate assistance. Poe was carried to Washington Medical College, where he drifted in and out of consciousness for 4 days. He never recovered. At dawn on Sunday, October 7th, 1849, at precisely 5 o'clock in the morning, Edgar Allan Poe died. He was 40 years old. No one ever heard a full account of what had happened to him. When questioned, Poe was too disoriented to explain how he had ended up in Baltimore or why his clothes, ill-fitting and soiled, belonged to another man. Witnesses claimed that on the night before his death, he kept calling out the name Reynolds. No one knows who Reynolds was. His attending physician, Dr. John Moran, recorded Poe's final words, "Lord, help my poor soul." Then silence. All the hospital records vanished. His death certificate, notes, even the attending logs, leaving only speculation and rumor. Newspapers reported the cause of death as congestion of the brain or cerebral inflammation, genteel terms of the time often used to disguise deaths from alcohol or disgrace. But mystery, fittingly, followed him into the grave. Over the decades, theories multiplied: delirium tremens, heart disease, epilepsy, syphilis, rabies, carbon monoxide poisoning, and one stranger theory from 1872 that he was a victim of cooping, a violent electoral scam in which men were kidnapped, drugged, disguised, and forced to vote multiple times. Whatever the truth, the final days of Edgar Allan Poe remain as shadowed and elusive as his stories, a riddle sealed in darkness, whispered only by the wind over his unmarked grave. Death did not bring Edgar Allan Poe peace. It brought him slander. Within hours of his burial in Baltimore, a venomous obituary appeared in the New York Tribune. It was unsigned, attributed only to a mysterious Ludwig. The first line struck like a cold blade. Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it. The article painted Poe as a madman, a creature of darkness wandering the streets in madness or melancholy, muttering curses and prayers, convinced of his own damnation. The author behind Ludwig was soon unmasked, Rufus Wilmot Griswold, a literary rival who had loathed Poe since 1842. In life, Poe had mocked Griswold's mediocrity. In death, Griswold saw his chance for revenge. Griswold somehow managed to insert himself into Poe's legacy, claiming to be his literary executor, a role no one had formally granted him. From that position, he began a campaign to poison the world's memory of Poe. In 1850, Griswold published Memoir of the Author as the introduction to a posthumous collection of Poe's works. There, he described him as a drunken, depraved, drug-addled madman, a man driven by demons rather than genius. He even included fabricated letters to prove his case. The truth was far different. Poe was not the opium addict Griswold claimed, nor the unhinged lunatic his enemies portrayed. He was a man haunted by grief, yes, but also disciplined, sharp, and deeply self-aware. Those who had known him personally, John Neal, Sarah Helen Whitman, George Graham, denounced Griswold's lies. Neal even ridiculed him as a petty man desperate for a thimbleful of newspaper notoriety. But lies travel faster than corrections. Griswold's portrait of Poe, the cursed raving poet of the macabre, became the version readers wanted to believe. His distorted biography was reprinted endlessly, fueling the Gothic legend of Poe as the doomed genius consumed by his own madness. Ironically, the very slander meant to destroy him ensured his immortality. Poe's life had ended in mystery, but his myth, twisted, tragic, and unforgettable, was only beginning. Edgar Allan Poe's name has become inseparable from the shadows of Gothic horror. The flicker of candlelight over a coffin lid, the beating of a heart beneath the floorboards, the whisper of something not quite dead. His stories didn't just entertain, they unsettled. They pulled readers into the quiet terror of their own minds. Death was his constant companion, not only in life, but on the page. He explored its every form and echo, the stillness of a corpse, the horror of premature burial, the slow corruption of the body, and the haunting idea that the dead might not stay dead. In stories like The Fall of the House of Usher, The Black Cat, and The Premature Burial, he dissected fear itself, not the fear of monsters, but of memory, guilt, and decay. Yet Poe's darkness wasn't mere morbidity. It was a rebellion, a reaction against the bright optimism of the transcendentalists, the popular philosophers of his day who believed in divine harmony and human goodness. Poe found their ideas naive, their metaphors excessive. He mocked them as frog-pondians, a jab at the Boston Common Pond where they gathered, and dismissed their writings as metaphor-run mad and mysticism for mysticism's sake. Still, in private letters, he confessed he did not despise them all. Only the pretenders who dressed confusion as depth. But there was more to Poe than the grave and the ghastly. Beneath the gloom, he was also a master satirist, witty, sharp, and mischievous. His lesser-known tales brimmed with sarcasm, irony, and absurd humor, mocking the literary cliches and pseudosciences of his time. His very first published story, Metzingerstein, often read as a Gothic nightmare, was originally meant as a parody of those same Gothic tropes, a dark joke that history took too seriously. He wrote hoaxes and humors as eagerly as horrors. In the balloon hoax, for example, he faked a newspaper report about a successful transatlantic flight, convincing many readers that man had conquered the skies. Long before the term science fiction existed, Poe was already imagining where invention might lead. To flight, to catastrophe, to the unknown. Even in his essays and criticism, Poe wandered into strange territories. Phrenology, physiognomy, astrology, cosmology, the pseudosciences of his day. He treated them not with blind faith, but with fascination, probing how belief itself could become a kind of madness. In the end, Poe's genius lived in contradiction. A writer of horror who laughed at horror, a skeptic who wrote about the supernatural, a man of reason who peered into the abyss. He did not just write about darkness. He understood it, and perhaps he belonged to it. For Edgar Allan Poe, writing was never a matter of inspiration alone. It was architecture. Every word, every pause, every heartbeat of rhythm had to serve a purpose. Behind the wild imagination and haunted imagery was a mind obsessed with structure, precision, and effect. In his essays and criticism, especially the poetic principle and the philosophy of composition, Poe laid out what would become some of the most influential literary theories of the 19th century. He rejected moral preaching and imitation, calling didacticism the death of art. To Poe, a poem or story that tried to teach was no longer a poem. It was a sermon in disguise. Instead, he argued that the artist's highest duty was the pursuit of beauty, not beauty as ornament, but as emotional truth, distilled to its purest form. That which is unique, he wrote, is alone of value. Art, in his view, must create a single, unified effect, a feeling or atmosphere so deliberate that every sentence contributes to it. Anything that did not strengthen that effect, he considered extraneous. Poe's stories and poems, from The Telltale Heart to The Raven, follow this principle like clockwork. He believed that true genius was not chaotic inspiration, but mathematical design. Every image, sound, and symbol calculated to move the reader toward one overwhelming emotion. In The Philosophy of Composition, he famously described how he constructed the Raven step by step, choosing its length, tone, and refrain, never more, with methodical care. To him, art was not a storm of passion, but a science of feeling. Not everyone believed him. Critics such as T.S. Eliot and Joseph Wood Crutch dismissed the essay as clever posturing, a performance of intellect after the fact, not a true reflection of how the poem was written. Eliot wryly remarked that if Poe had truly plotted The Raven with such precision, he might have taken a little more pains over it. But whether sincere or self-mythologizing, Poe's theories revealed the mind of a man who sought to master his own chaos. He wanted to prove that even the most emotional art, the most haunting cry in the dark, could be engineered, measured, and shaped into beauty. In the end, that was his paradox, a poet of madness who demanded method, a dreamer who built his nightmares with a ruler and compass. In his own lifetime, Edgar Allan Poe was not known as the master of horror or the father of detective fiction. He was feared and admired as a critic. A sharp-tongued, unrelenting reviewer, Poe carved through America's literary pretensions with a blade dipped in wit and venom. Fellow critic James Russell Lowell once called him the most discriminating, philosophical, and fearless critic upon imaginative works who has written in America, adding that Poe seemed to use prussic acid instead of ink. It was not far from the truth. His scathing reviews earned him the nickname, the Tomahawk Man. Poe's favorite target was Boston's poetic darling, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He accused him of what he called the heresy of the didactic, writing poetry that lectured rather than inspired, that mimicked rather than invented. In one of his famously ruthless predictions, Poe wrote, "We grant him high qualities, but deny him the future." He was right. Though America resisted him in life, Europe embraced him in death. Poe became one of the first American writers to achieve greater fame overseas than at home. The French poet Charles Baudelaire, himself a genius of the macabre, translated Poe's works and hailed him as a kindred spirit. To generations of French readers, Baudelaire's translations became the Poe, definitive, musical, and darkly romantic. Through these, Poe's influence seeped into European literature, shaping writers like Mallarmé, Dumas, and Verne. he also invented something entirely new. With tales like The Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter, Poe created the blueprint for the detective story, before Sherlock Holmes, before Hercule Poirot. Arthur Conan Doyle later wrote, "Each of Poe's detective stories is a root from which a whole literature has developed." So deep was his influence that the mystery writers of America named their top prize the Edgar. Poe's imagination didn't stop at mystery or horror. He peered into science fiction long before the term existed. His fascination with exploration, air travel, and speculative science inspired writers like Jules Verne, who even wrote a sequel to Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, titled An Antarctic Mystery. H.G. Wells called Pym what a very intelligent mind could imagine about the South Polar region a century ago. His shadow stretches further still. H.P. Lovecraft called Poe his god of fiction, borrowing the unity of effect principle for his own cosmic nightmares. Alfred Hitchcock credited Poe as the reason he ever made suspense films. Vladimir Nabokov laced his novels with references to him. And in Japan, the mystery writer Taro Hirai honored him by adopting the pen name Edogawa Ranpo, a phonetic echo of Edgar Allan Poe. Of course, fame and imitation come with mockery. Poe's detractors, from Emerson, who sneered, "I see nothing in it," after reading The Raven, to Aldous Huxley, who said Poe wore a diamond ring on every finger, dismissed him as overwrought or vulgar. Even Yeats called him vulgar. But while their criticism faded, Poe's name endured, whispered in candlelight, and carved into the foundations of modern literature. In the end, even his rarest book, Tamerlane and Other Poems, a tiny volume of verse ignored in his youth, became a symbol of his resurrection. In 2009, a single surviving copy sold at auction for $662,500, a record for American literature. Once buried in debt and ridicule, Edgar Allan Poe now rests among the immortals, a man who turned the darkness of his life into the eternal light of his art. Few knew it then, but Edgar Allan Poe was not only a poet of the macabre, he was also one of America's first codebreakers. In the late 1830s, when newspapers were filled with gossip, scandal, and serialized fiction, Poe introduced something entirely different: mystery in language itself. He announced in Alexander's weekly Express Messenger that he could solve any cipher readers dared to send him. They did, and he did. His uncanny ability to decode the hidden messages sent by the public made him a small legend among readers and editors alike. In July 1841, he expanded on this fascination in an essay titled A Few Words on Secret Writing, published in Graham's Magazine. Here, Poe explored the art and psychology of ciphers, not as a mathematician, but as a literary detective. He understood that most people were enchanted by the idea of secret writing, but ignorant of how simple many ciphers truly were. Using his intuition and analytical precision, the same skills that birthed C. Auguste Dupin, his fictional detective, Poe demonstrated how easily such mysteries could be unraveled. That same year, he transformed this obsession into art. His short story, The Gold Bug, revolved around a hidden message and the deciphering of a secret code, blending treasure hunting, cryptography, and adventure into one of the most popular works of his career. The story won him a literary prize and captivated readers everywhere, sparking a national craze for newspaper cryptograms. Poe's method was simple, mainly substitution ciphers, replacing one symbol for another. But his showmanship made it thrilling. He turned problem-solving into theater, intellect into entertainment. Two of the coded puzzles he published in 1841 under the pseudonym W.B. Tyler remained unsolved for over 150 years, with one finally cracked in 1992 and the other in 2000. But perhaps Poe's greatest impact came long after his death. His fascination with hidden messages inspired future generations, among them William Friedman, who would go on to become America's most celebrated cryptologist. Friedman once said that his lifelong passion for codes began after reading The Gold Bug as a child. Decades later, that passion would help him break Japan's Purple Code during World War II, a turning point in modern cryptography. So, while Poe's tales of the supernatural made him immortal in literature, his love of ciphers left an invisible legacy, one written not in ink, but in secrets, symbols, and the quiet thrill of solving the unsolvable. Today, the trail of Edgar Allan Poe's life winds across America like a ghost's shadow, from Boston to Baltimore, from Richmond to the Bronx, each city claiming a fragment of his haunted legacy. None of Poe's childhood homes survive, not even Moldavia, the grand Richmond estate of the Allan family who raised him. Yet, the city still keeps his memory alive through the Edgar Allan Poe Museum, housed in the old stone house, Richmond's oldest standing residence. Though Poe never lived there, its rooms are filled with relics from his youth, manuscripts, portraits, and personal belongings from his time with the Allans. The museum even preserves several first editions of his works, fragile pages that once introduced the world to his darkness. In Charlottesville, the dorm room where Poe studied languages at the University of Virginia, 13 West Range, has been lovingly preserved. Maintained by students and faculty of the Raven Society, the small room remains almost exactly as it was in 1826. A bare desk, a narrow bed, and the ghost of a young man who once dreamed of greatness. In Baltimore, the earliest surviving home he occupied still stands at 203 North Amity Street, the modest brick dwelling where the struggling writer lived with his aunt Maria Clem, her daughter Virginia, and, for a time, other members of his family. It is now the Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum, preserved as a testament to the years when his genius flickered in poverty. Between 1834 and 1844, Poe's restless spirit moved through Philadelphia, living in at least 4 different residences. The last of these, at 532 North 7th Street, has been preserved by the National Park Service as the Edgar Allan Poe National Historic Site. Here, visitors can walk the rooms where he wrote The Telltale Heart and The Fall of the House of Usher, stories that still echo through the creaking floors. His final refuge, the humble cottage in Fordham, remains one of the most poignant landmarks of all. Nestled in the Bronx, the Edgar Allan Poe cottage stands where he wrote some of his most sorrowful works and watched over his dying wife, Virginia. In Boston, the city of his birth, the original house at 62 Carver Street no longer exists. The street itself was renamed Charles Street South, and only a commemorative plaque remains nearby on Boylston Street. In 2009, the intersection of Charles and Boylston was officially renamed Edgar Allan Poe Square. 5 years later, on October 5, 2014, the city unveiled a striking bronze statue titled Poe Returning to Boston, sculpted by Stephanie Rocknack. It depicts Poe striding forward against the wind, a raven in flight beside him, and a trail of papers, his life's work, swirling in his wake. Other cities, too, bear traces of him. On New York's Upper West Side, a plaque marks the site where he is believed to have written The Raven. On Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, where he once served as a young soldier and later set The Gold Bug, stands Poe's Tavern, a lively tribute to his time there. And in Baltimore's Fells Point, a weathered bar named The Horse You Came In, on claims to be the last place Poe was seen drinking before his mysterious death. Locals say that the poet never really left, that his ghost, whom they call Edgar, still haunts the rooms upstairs, forever pacing between legend and longing. Across every city, his name endures, not just on plaques or statues, but in whispers, in candlelight, and in the quiet spaces where words outlive the man who wrote them. And so ends the story of Edgar Allan Poe, a man who lived as if born under a cloud, forever chasing beauty through darkness. His life was a cycle of brilliance and ruin, of soaring imagination and crushing despair. He wandered from city to city, Boston, Richmond, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, never belonging entirely to any of them, yet leaving a shadow on them all. Poe was a man divided. In him lived both the scientist and the dreamer, the architect and the madman. He built stories like machines, each gear precise, each emotion measured. And yet, when the mechanism came to life, it trembled with something human, tragic, and eternal. He wrote of death not because he worshipped it, but because he could not escape it. From his mother's passing when he was a child, to the loss of Virginia in the pale light of that Bronx cottage, death was his most faithful companion. It walked beside him, whispered to him, and in the end, claimed him quietly, as though finishing a line he had begun long ago. In his time, Poe was misunderstood. He was mocked by peers, slandered by rivals, and haunted by poverty. He never found stability or peace or even kindness that lasted. But in the centuries that followed, the world came to understand what his contemporaries could not. That genius often wears the mask of misfortune. His works would outlive all the critics who scorned him. His ideas, once seen as eccentric, would become the foundation of modern mystery, horror, and psychological fiction. He gave the world its first detective, its first modern horror stories, and the earliest echoes of science fiction. He turned literature into an experiment in emotion and criticism into an art form. He wrote of the soul's decay, but also of its beauty, of how even in terror, there could be grace. Today, we do not read The Raven, The Telltale Heart, or The Fall of the House of Usher merely as stories. We read them as echoes of a man's mind, fragments of a genius who tried to understand the thin line between reason and madness, and what it means to be human when both begin to blur. His homes may have vanished, his letters burned, his death lost in rumor and conjecture, but the voice of Edgar Allan Poe endures. It lingers in every whispered nevermore, in every flicker of candlelight that stretches across a silent room. In the end, Poe found what he had always sought: immortality through art. He died poor, but he left behind a treasury of nightmares and beauty that no wealth could ever measure. So if you listen closely, late at night, when the world is quiet, you might still hear it. The soft scratch of a quill, a breath between words, the eternal murmur of a soul that refused to rest. Edgar Allan Poe, dreamer, critic, cryptographer, poet of shadows, still walks among us, not in flesh, but in every story that dares to find beauty in darkness and truth in madness. So as the night deepens and the world grows still, perhaps it's fitting to let his voice fade once more into the dark, where ravens murmur and lost souls whisper, and the writer who dreamt of eternity finally finds his peace. Good night.